We spoke a lot about local MCPs and security and what features you can do and what cool things you can do with MCP. I'm gonna try to show how just by changing the info of how you host your own MCP, you can enable much more features and go to broader audiences. Yeah, so before, small icebreaker about me. So I'm Rom. I'm a software engineer in Monday.com. You can access my LinkedIn later if you want to speak with me. Cool facts about me. I'm a winter person. I like tea more than coffee. Actually, I don't drink coffee, so I'm a living proof you don't need coffee to operate. I really like philosophy, and I have a second degree in it. It's a big dissonance from the first degree in computer science, but I think it really shines in the opinionated world of MCP. And my hobby is a gamer. I play Destiny, if someone knows this game, for over 10 years now. And like with MCP, I take a lot of things to the edge. So a bit with gaming as well. I had more of a competition ground in gaming in the edge. So a bit sneak peek on me, but we're going to speak on MCP. So what are we going to speak about in this lecture? One is what is remote MCP server and how we're going to use it. Second is why should you host your own MCP server? And after hopefully I convince you that it's something you want to invest in, we're going to see a bit of examples of how you can host your own MCP server and how did we do it. So what is remote MCP? Let me start by a small video of something that you probably didn't see a lot. So we heard in the security lecture now about OAuth and using OAuth as part of MCP. So we implemented it. So basically in this example, I'm going to show how it looks like in a real world example. So here I'm opening Claud. You can see that once I opened Claud, it redirected me to the OAuth screen, which basically is the OAuth screen that we implemented in our company. So once the user sees the screen, you can see the scopes and activate or decide to not activate like all the permissions that you want to use. And from that, it's like business as usual. You can use your MCP tools and interact with the activity you want regularly. So how did we implement it, or how does it look behind the scenes? So basically, we have an app in our marketplace that you can install that basically wraps all the functionalities and the OAuth that we need for the application. User can install it and then is redirected to whatever LLM client he wants to use and how to use the Monday MCP with it. How does it look like from dev-oriented side or configuration behind the scenes? So you can see on the left side for local MCPs that user must use the package of the MCPs that we use. So basically here it's like we had some package at the beginning that were like hosting our MCP server and all the tools that we had. And he must provide his own token, which is a security breach by itself, and we'll speak about it a bit. But in the remote MCP world, which is what we use now with the hosted MCP, we don't need to specify not the package or not the tokens or any other parameter because the user gets it behind the scene once it specifies our server URL. So obviously, in order to do this server, we need the operating server that implements one of the MCP standards, whether it's SNC or streamable HTTP. And we're going to go a bit more at the end, a bit more in depth on how you can do it. So why should you use it, or why should you invest the time in changing your info to be a remote MCP? So there's like 4 main points that at least I really like. Things that really makes it a strong way to go forward in the MCP world. One is control. So as we saw that the old MCP way is using the package that you can specify specific version and you have security breaches there, but also not always the code or the latest code releases will be for users. Dynamic tool control, which basically allows us more governance of tool. Audience, basically the remote MCP allows you to go for broader audience and not only dev-oriented users, and also to host it in more apps or web apps. And security, it's a bit more secure, and we're going to go a bit more in depth on each of them. So the first one is security. So we heard a lot about security, and we're going to show example on how we're going to do it here. So in the left side, we're going to see in the local MCP, user must have his own token inside of the MCP JSON file that he hosts. Actually, a security breach that we found here is that we saw that part of the cursor context is getting all your files in order to send them and do all the cool operations that he does. One of the files he's scanning is the MCP JSON, or we can scan it. In other words, takes the tokens that you have or your production token as part of the context that you're using, is basically exposing your token to the world. Which is probably something that you don't want to do. In the right side, you can see that in the hosted MCP version, we don't specify the token. We just specify the URL of the servers that we are using. The token is then by the OAuth flow and everything is saved in some key vault, and the LLM client, whether it's Claud or Cursor or any other one that you're using, is not aware of this token and basically cannot click it. Control. One of the biggest problems that we had with MCP is the fact that it's hosted by package, which means it's a version. Usually it's installed once globally when the users install the package, if you're using it with the main clients. And which means, in other words, that unless they update it like globally and in purpose is not going to get new versions, at least most of the times. And the MCP world is always changing. We're adding new tools, changing existing tools, changing an info to be better. And it got us a lot of problems with users keeping on complaining or not getting the newest tools or not having things work as proper. And we always need to tell them, update your package to the latest, or maybe upgrade your node, or start messing with all of these scenarios. In the remote MCP, you don't have it anymore because it's a server. So all our code is like in production. It's deployed on a server. So basically, users are always getting the newest code because it's like we have the deployment that hosts this code. Obviously, you can still do versioning, regular REST versioning. You can do the server /v1 or /v2 or do monkey patching or whatever you need to do in the server. But basically, you have your own control of the code and everything that the users interact with, which solved a lot of problems for us. The third thing, and it's a bit more advanced, but it's the dynamic tool control. And basically, when you want to host your MCP or like give the MCP tools that you want for bigger enterprise or even smaller companies that want more control or are afraid of dangerous operations, you cannot really limit it with the regular MCP. Because in the end, every user can define and get the tools that you want, and you don't have granularity over it. In the remote MCP, because it's in our server, so we also can have some kind of operations that, based on some permissions or users or settings that the user have, can show what tools we want to achieve or give the users and what tools we don't want. So this is just a small POC of how it can look like. So basically, user can have some control screens that they can define what entities or what personalities or what tools you want to enable in the MCP. And basically, what it doesn't choose here, it's also not going to get, or users are not going to get as part of his MCP app, which gives them a lot more safety that they need when they're using the MCP in production use cases, especially for non-developers, which brings us to the last reason, which is the audience. The local MCP, as said a lot in the previous conversation, is very dev-oriented. And it makes sense because you need to install some package manager, Node for instance. It's available mostly for desktop apps that you need to install, whether Cursor or Claud. And it's very hard, like going to a non-technical person and trying to explain to him how to install package manager, and then sometimes you need to install different versions for different operations and install the apps. I don't know if anyone here tried to like use MCP with Claud. You need to go outside of Claud to some file, and it's very, very hard. And with the remote MCP, a lot of this hassle is getting just removed because now you don't need any installation of NPM or other package manager. It's just like an application that the user can use, as we saw the example before. And now it's available for Claude Desktop or GPT or Microsoft ecosystem or Slack now. And all of them are just not available for non-hosted MCP server because obviously these companies will not install every NPM package that uses MCP in order to use it. So basically now you're also opening your feature to a lot of more possibilities and opening it to be used by like every other user that doesn't need like developer-oriented tools, for instance, sales. So to summarize, why do we want to have a remote MCP? We want to control of the latest code or every code that user runs. We want to have a dynamic tool control and more governance. We want to give it to broader audience, not only to developers, and also we want to have more apps that will be able to be hosted on top of it. And we want to be more secure. And I think with the remote MCP, a lot of the problems that were mentioned in the last presentation about security are actually getting resolved. Not all of them, but at least some of them. Okay, so now hopefully I intrigued you about creating your own remote MCP. Let's try to understand what we need to do in order to host your own remote MCP. So there are two options so you can pursue, like with everything. So one is build your own server, and we're going to show how to do that. And second one is host on top of a provider, which is actually the way that we are actually doing now. Might change in the future. Same as how things used to be in Promise, and now we have cloud providers, so it's kind of the same thing. So how are we going to use it in our own MCP server? So there are three things from dev side that we need to do. The first one is creating the endpoints. Basically, if you're implementing Streamer HTTP or SCC, there are the /MCP endpoints or the /message endpoints that you need to implement. The second thing is validating the token, if you have one, or whatever authentication method that you have. Most servers are not like a simple math server that doesn't need authentication. You usually interact with some product. And the third thing is session management, which is something that is a bit more unique to MCP. I'm going to go more in depth about one of them. I'll let you guess which. Obviously, validating the token. But session management. So what is session management? I'll read this and then I'll explain it in more friendly words. So keeping track of conversations, like transport between your LLM application, like Claude, and your server across multiple requests. Or in better words, when the LLM client, for instance, Claude, makes a request to your MCP, we want to keep the session active between different requests, sometimes even between LLM clients. And for instance, if we have a stateful MCP, or shopping cart is the classic example, we don't want every request to reset the shopping cart, and we sometimes even want different LLM applications to access the same shopping cart. So session management is how we're going to achieve that and not make sure the application will restart on every usage. So what do we need to do in order to create this session management? We need to create the session ID, basically some unique identifiers that we will be able to look up the session for the user. We need to set up the transport for the conversation, which basically is the transport is something that you get from the SDK package of the MCP, which is how we're going to communicate with the tools, and obviously look up the session for future use cases. So how does it look behind the scenes? It's pretty simple diagram. So basically, once the user is using the /MCP endpoint in order to start conversating with our server, we generate the session ID. You can generate it whatever you want, like simple UUID. Then we need to store the transport and basically have it available for future conversations. And in the end, when the user makes the subsequent request, or the LLM client gives us the session ID, we need to look up and connect the right transport to execute the tool. So if we go to the full example, for instance, with SSC, which a lot of people call it legacy, but I think it's going to be reason more in the future, just because Turnable HTTP have a lot of its own problems. But basically, users is the LLM client is doing the request to the /MCP endpoint. If needed, the session validates the bearer tokens that the user grants. Then we are creating the server and connecting it to a unique transport. And then in the subsequent request, when we get the tools that we want to activate and also the session ID, again, validating the token, we're extracting the session IDs that we want to use and look up the transport and connecting it to it. And now we can execute the tool that's as regularly as we would have done. In the Turnable HTTP, it's kind of the same thing, just with less steps, or at least one route. We're doing the same step. Just the difference here is that, we have one route, and by some parameter on the bodies that we're going to see soon, we know if we need to generate a session or to use an existing one. So how are we going to implement that? So the first thing we need to do is to handle the transport. I'm going to show a basic use case here that will fit, I guess, most use cases at least today, and maybe not the most advanced use cases that we have in the future, and we'll touch a bit that on soon. But you can just have some JavaScript objects that will look the transport and the session IDs that are connected to them. Then we need to create the session. Basically, the first thing that we need to do, this example is Turnable HTTP. So we need to look up on the body if it has the initialize method. This is how we know if we want to generate new session or to use an existing session. So basically, we are generating the session. You can generate it whatever you feel like. UUID before is just a standard one, but I also recommend sometimes giving a prefix of the user ID when you want to look up the sessions for specific users in the future, or account ID. Then we need to create the transport. This is a function that you don't need to create yourself. You get it from the SDK library of MCP. So Anthropic created this for us. Then we are connected the transport to the session ID in the object that we saved, and we are returning the header of the session ID to the LLM client, so we can know how to use it in the next calls. The second thing is handling existing session. So if we now know that we want to execute a tool, we are getting the header of the MCP session ID out of the request, lookuping the right transport, obviously throwing an error if it doesn't exist, and then we just activate the tools that we want to use. And obviously, the third thing that we want to implement in order to not have a session ID else is to have the delete endpoint. Again, it's something that the LLM client should know how to handle. And if it doesn't know, not everyone knows, you'll probably need to invalidate them yourself. But obviously, we want to delete sessions that are not active anymore. So is it that simple? So I think for most use cases, it is that simple. And I'll also link examples on how to do it later. But it's pretty simple to do it for the simple examples. When it gets complicated, so the bottom left picture really emphasizes how it can look like in bigger use cases. But basically, there's a lot of infra here that you need to manage to really have this unique change of MCP working in big production. So basically, you can have multiple servers that you might need load balance for. You need to manage the connection uptimes. So not always the MCP clients will delete it for you. You need to make sure to delete it yourself and know how to invalidate it. Some sessions you want to be available for a long, long time. I'm sure you have a lot of sites that you came to and saw that the cards that you have is available even weeks later. Sometimes with MCP, you want to do that as well. Your server obviously needs to survive restarts without losing the session state. So the same with deployment. Specifically in MCP, it's a bit different because you have active session. and not necessarily some active DB records that host it, although you can. So you need to make sure that even if the server scale down or restart, you know how to create a new session for the user and save the state for it. And server stickiness. This is kind of something new for MCPs, but basically, for instance, you want to have one session that will be available when the user interacts in the same app from Cursor or Claud or any other MCP client that he's using. And you need to know how to update and interact with multiple sessions. So this is our use cases that when you want to consider complex options. So obviously you can implement them yourself. There aren't many, if any, good examples that at least I found on how to implement good servers that support any of this. And the reason for it, it's pretty new, and the world is still like going in baby steps on how to do it properly. But the better option here is to host it on top of a provider, like you're using Claud to get a lot of resources managed by other companies. You can do the same thing here. And there are some big providers that already have it. More come, like I think every day a new provider comes. I think in the end there will be some kings, but Cloudflare, Azure, and Google Cloud, I think, are the biggest that I saw out there. I think Google Cloud, you can also only do it in Python. It doesn't support Node.js, as far as I know. We are using Cloudflare, but there are other apps available there. So I guess everyone here will have some kind of choice to make. I'm going to show the example of how it looks with Cloudflare and how we implemented and went to production with it. So this is the flow of what happens when you use Cloudflare. The LLM client initiates a request. This gets to the Cloudflare client servers that we have. It has some access token verification against Cloudflare. Then Cloudflare tries to do the OAuth mechanism against Monday. If we're going to the OAuth way, this initiates the screen that I showed at the previous example in the video. Then once the user accepts it, we save the token in our MCP server. For us, it's in a key vault inside Cloudflare. Then we are returning the data back to the MCP client for the session ID, and then you can just initiate tool requests as usual, and they just get to the server instead of locally in his machine. So how does it look code-wise? There are two ways to implement it. One is using OAuth, which is usually the best practice way for most use cases. And so this is what you can see at the beginning. It's actually kind of wrapped for us in Cloudflare. I'm sure all the other apps are wrapping it for you as well. But basically, you just provide them some parameters and a handler, which is how you're going to do OAuth. And the first example at the top is this one, if you can see my cursor. Is how you're going to do it with OAuth token. So not every company still have OAuth mechanisms that they want to enable, and not every scenario, unfortunately, is fit for OAuth. I'll give an example for us. We wanted to connect it with Copilot, and Copilot doesn't support the OAuth flow that we are supporting. They have their own OAuth flow, and then they're passing the token. So it's still like very secure because still there is an OAuth going behind the scene and some key vault that saves the token. It just happens on Copilot side and not on our server side, which is fine as well, and we support that too. And then the second step is enabling OAuth. I'm not going to go in depth here because everyone have their own OAuth mechanism, and the previous lecture explained in depth what OAuth is. But basically, you need to have your own OAuth mechanism implemented in some ways that fits your company or your needs. The third thing is return the state for the MCP. Basically, you have some variables that you want to have for each MCP or subsequent MCP calls that have. So for instance, there are some params like the access token or the API version or some naming that you want to have every MCP tool that is being requested by our client to have. For instance, and it's a very good example of how Zapier did MCPs, you can also like have part of this state a workspace ID or a board ID or whatever you want to only be in the context of every MCP tool, and then really give very good granularity or very good control of what tools scope you have inside the MCP server. The last part, the first part, is to initialize the tools. So basically, this is also regularly, you have your own MCP server, client, whatever tools that you want to initialize. This is basically initializing all our tools with parameters. We can see that we have also a server for the toolkit, which is how we're going to filter out tools and give the admin control and granularities that we said before. And basically, I guess most of you can enable it with some provider in less than a day and get all the features that we spoke about at the beginning. I have some useful link here that you can look later about how you can create your own remote MCP server with examples, something that really helped me when creating a remote MCP server, and also remote MCP list for another best practices. There aren't many, there are less than 40, and less than 20 of them are actually implementing OAuth, but the list goes every day, so worth looking into. Yeah, and I'll do a short summary. So basically, I explained you what remote MCP is, and we saw what it enables. We spoke a bit about why should you host your own MCP for security reasons, for governance, for server for server controlling of tools, and also for enabling it for broader audience and not only developers. That's it. I hope you had fun. Have a great continue of your day.